Hello everyone, I'm Dan Limbach from Pharma Voice, and I'd like to welcome you to today's event entitled The Power of Influence, Connecting Healthcare Influencers to Pharma Brand Strategy, brought to you by Pharma Voice and sponsored by our good friends at IMS. We have an outstanding crowd today with folks from all around the world. Thanks for investing the time to attend. We'll certainly do our very best to make it worth your while. Let's meet our thought leader. We're pleased to have Anindita Basu, Senior Principal, Center of Excellence, Commercial Strategy at IMS. Welcome, Anindita. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dan. Hi, everyone. This is Anindita from IMS. I would be sharing primarily some of the insights that IMS has obtained doing research and thought leadership on the different influencers and the changing stakeholders in the pharma market. We will share the key highlights of the study. We will also share our experience and our approach that we are working with clients to help them understand the key stakeholders, their control, their complexity, their influence, and eventually tie this all back to their commercial model. We all are privy to the changing pharma landscape. In the last 5 years, a lot of changes have happened in this space, and there has been increase not only in the number of key players and stakeholders, but their level of influence. Firstly, that has come into play in the last 4 or 5 years is policy. The policy, we are seeing a continuum of change in policy, introduction of new healthcare policy. Government is emerging and getting more engaged. There is evolving influence from ACO, health exchanges. The second influence point in this landscape are payers. Payers have been there since the last decade, but their control, their influence has increased over time. They are concentrated in regional as well as in national levels. They are using more healthcare research, real-world evidence, information to make decisions. And hence, their decision-making is not just simple, it is multi-channel informed and way more complex to understand. The third point here is the provider. The provider landscape has moved away from a traditional reach and frequency where, a sales force arms race was enough to move the needle. Today, solo practices are almost decreasing in numbers, and they're either evolving into being affiliated to an IDN or corporate owner or even a group practice. And it is really, really important for us to understand this change because our commercial models, our commercial approaches are aligned to that. And last but not least are patients. Patients are a big influencer in decision making. Patients have a lot of information at their disposal. Social media has played a big role in pharma. In addition to that, there is a lot of patient-driven promotions that they have access to. Patients also have online resources. They are much more informed, and they do their own research when they go and talk to physicians. Additionally, out-of-pocket expense has become way more critical to patients. They are trying to understand how they can leverage a better plan, a better payer, or move on to a stage where they can save on out-of-pocket expense. And hence, we see generics dominating a lot of the therapeutic areas. With these different broader stakeholders in the market, it has become more and more critical for us to understand, build insights, and eventually integrate into our planning and implementation. With this, we will come to our first poll question.
That's right, Anindita. Thank you. Well, now we'd like to engage our audience a little bit and get some feedback from them. So if I can ask the operator to put the poll template up. The first question today is, what healthcare stakeholder listed below do you feel will demonstrate the greatest increase in its influence across the healthcare system during the next 3 years? Possible options are the patient, the group practice, the payer, the IDN, the U.S. government, or something else. So all you have to do is select one of those buttons to the left of your response and click the Submit Answer button. So while we're waiting for that, Anindita, there has been a significant discussion in both clinical and policy terms regarding the rise of outcome-centered models where protocols and the payment for those protocols will be more likely paid if given proof of more favorable patient results. How does the prospect of an outcome center model play out in terms of the influence that stakeholders will have? Who does it help?
Well, what I have seen from my experience and my research is that a lot of the focus is moving towards patients. Pharma companies are under a lot of pressure in terms of patient experience management, patient acquisition and retention, how patients manage their diseases, what kind of tools and applications can be provided. A lot of money is being invested in clinical trials, clinical investigation, even clinical education. So I think the focus is moving away, and that is primarily because the government are more focused on patients and their well-being, and also trying to reduce inefficiencies as well as costs. And so on one end, definitely that is extremely positive, but we need to keep that as the focus and redesign our approach to talk to our key stakeholders, to influence them, to be able to move them.
Very good. Thank you. Well, let's take a look at the results of the poll. And Anindita, what do you make of these results? Any surprises, or is this what you were expecting to see?
Oh, this is great. I think I kind of summarized, and the audience feels the same way. You see the U.S. government being the biggest influencer. You see patients to be a pretty big influencer. What surprises me is that IDNs seem to be a small influencer, but my thinking here is that with the emergence of ACOs, IDNs in the next 2-3 years likely will become an ACO. They will also have their own plan and become a payer. And with that, it will be almost a mix of commercial and contracting strategy. So that bar, when you couple that with the payer bar, would be pretty big from an influence standpoint.
Outstanding. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move you to the next slide. I'd like to thank the audience for participating, and we'll have one more poll a little bit later in the presentation. And Anindita, you may continue.
Thank you, Dan. Okay. So we'll get back to the scenario where we talked about the multiple, stimuli or levers, right? If you group these multiple influences into broader buckets, what we see is that there are the health system, which comprises of the IDNs, the ACOs, the group practice, the affiliations, the corporate owners, so on and so forth, right? Those are growing in power, growing in influence and control. There, of course, is managed care, plan access, control, out-of-pocket, and copay differentials, and tier statuses, which has always been important, but it's growing in its importance. Patients and peers have become really critical because of information being readily available. Our clients are focusing on patient-driven promotions, and hence they have become a key decision influence on the decision maker. At times, they make their own decisions and inform the physician. And the fourth bucket, not to downplay that, is promotions and marketing. Of course, there is the traditional promotion, which is detailing and sampling, journal, conferences. But in addition to that, there's a lot of emphasis these days on the non-personal promotion, which is, more like not directed towards physicians and rep, but reaching out to physicians via email, via, internet or mailers. And these non-personal promotions have picked up in the last few years in terms of effectiveness, and that is primarily driven by access issues which have been imposed by the health system. So these are the broader buckets of influences. We will, for today's discussion, only focus on the IDNs, touch on the ACO influence. Next slide, please. So as I said, ACOs are a newcomer in this market landscape. There is a lot of ambiguity about who they are, what their role is going to be in the next 4 or 5 years. Of course, today, their focus, they already cover almost 20% of the entire population. There are around 154 organizations participating. There are actually slightly over 93 or 94 ACOs. This number is as of September, so this number is a little one or two off than what it is today. And what we are seeing is that ACOs are growing. They have different goals. They are trying to promote cost containment and improve patient outcome. Next slide, please. The key focus of today's discussion is going to be the IDNs. And the data here shows us the number that has grown year over year. It has been at a steady pace. And the CAGR is around 7% year over year. So currently there are slightly over 900 IDNs. And the major drivers for these organizations are they want to be able to promote patient experience as well as maintaining a lower cost for the patients. So that's where majority of them have that goal. In order to achieve that goal, they are pretty innovative in their operations. They are bringing in a lot of electronic medical records, electronic data into their analyses to be able to make better informed decisions for a better standard of care. For us and our clients, some critical questions are: how important are these organizations? If they are important, which are the ones that are important? And once we have identified that, how do we integrate that into our commercial models? Next slide, please. When working with multiple clients, we have heard them ask several questions, and we've been able to group these questions under certain phases in which they are. So we've identified that our clients are in three broader phases: investigation, identification and prioritization, and finally, implementation. A lot, I would say majority, of our clients are in the investigation phase. They understand that IDNs are important. What they want to understand is if IDNs are important to them. And if they are, how much do they matter? Is it only 20% of their business? In that case, really nothing needs to be done. But if it is 60% or 70% of their business and their portfolio, then clearly there is something that needs to be done to address this key stakeholder. And we've also heard our clients trying to understand the span of control, physicians that are affiliated, what kind of physicians they are, what kind of environment they are exposed to, what kind of patients are affiliated. So a lot of our clients are in this particular phase. They are investigating. We've also seen clients in the last couple of years move from investigation phase to the next phase, much more advanced, identification and prioritization. What they're trying to answer here is they know that IDNs are important. They have been able to quantify of what portion of their business are controlled by these complex stakeholders. What they want to understand is out of those 900 IDNs, not all of them could matter. So they want to be able to shortlist the IDNs that actually matter. It likely could be 100 or 150 or 200, but they want to know which are the ones that matter. We've seen, we've been working with clients, and we've seen that the most common metric that is used to identify these IDNs are size or volume. Size is kind of a proxy to volume. But in our experience, in our research, we feel that that is inadequate to help understand the main movers and shakers in this 900 IDNs. Along with volume or size, we believe, and we've tested this, that complexity and influence are extremely critical. You may be a large IDN, but if you're not complex enough, you can pretty much cover the IDN by a traditional sales force, because you can go and call the doctors that are affiliated. There are no strict policies in place. So it is important for us to understand complexity and influence. So clients have progressed to phase 2, which is understanding who they are and trying to align and prioritize that. In the last few years, we've seen a handful of our clients which have started implementing. So they've gone through investigation, they've gone through the second phase. Now they have taken these insights and tried to integrate into their commercial model. It's not a small task. It's a humongous task. We're talking about changing the current way that you design your sales model, design your promotional model, and eventually design the structure, right? So what a lot of our clients in this particular phase are doing, they're doing pilots. They're selecting certain territories, certain regions, and they're trying to implement key account management Salesforce structure and test how it's working, what are the gaps, and how it can be made more efficient. Next slide, please. With that, we will come to our poll question 2.
That's right. Thanks, Anindita. So this is our second poll question of 2, and we're looking for your participation once again. If I can get the operator to put the poll template up. The question is, how much focus does your organization place in accounting for integrated delivery networks, or IDNs, which we've been talking about, in conducting your commercial strategy? Is it not at all, we really haven't addressed this, and we don't even know where to begin? Or is it we're just beginning, we know this is a key area, but we're just beginning to form our strategy? Or maybe it's we have a strategy, but we haven't implemented it yet. We recognize the importance of IDNs to our commercial strategy, but we are currently in process of identifying the assets and insights we need to move forward. Or finally, it could be we have a strong focus. We've identified target IDNs, introduced pilot key account managers, and integrated our commercial model to account for IDN influence. So some pretty good choices in there. I'm interested to see what the feedback is. And indeed, many organizations adopt commercial models at a different pace. Without naming names, what have you seen in the marketplace in terms of looking at the IDNs and their behaviors as a source of commercial opportunity?
Well, typically, what we have found is that most companies are doing some kind of work. Majority of our clients are aware, and they're trying to understand, trying to identify. Completely changing on your Salesforce model or your commercial model is not an easy task, as I said. It takes time. So it's almost like a trial and error. You want to test something. You want to understand the gaps. You want to be able to bridge those gaps and then take it a step further, expand that, and then again do the measurement. So from start to finish, if you have to implement a new commercial model, we are talking about a couple of years, because there is an element of change management that is involved. There is an element of understanding what is the right structure, what are the different types of roles and responsibilities, what are the different qualifications for those roles and responsibilities, and more importantly, being able to hire the right kind of people to deploy for those roles and responsibilities. So even if the research and the analytics and the understanding can be done quickly, but the implementation and making sure the implementation works takes some time.
Very good. Let's take a look at the results. If the operator can post those, please. Okay, well, we've got a pretty good spread here, Anindita. What do you think about these results? Is that about what you thought you'd see today?
Yep. So I think, I agree with the green bar, which is a lot of folks have started to just, understanding the investigation phase, beginning to understand, beginning to look into this piece. In our experience, we've seen it's almost 50%. So that number is very, very close. Then the blue one, the 18.7%. I would agree with that too. A lot of our clients have moved to that phase, but what surprises me, and I'm happy about it, that almost 15% have started implementing a lot of the findings. We are currently working with a few of our clients, but it seems that number of implementation is much higher within the folks who are attending this webinar. So this is fantastic. Well, almost 1/4 believe that nothing has been done, but my understanding is that they also understand that something needs to be done, and so that is definitely great, because people in the industry know the importance of IDNs, know they're influential, so they're moving ahead to understand these stakeholders and eventually integrate that to their current processes.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Jen. So So we would like to share some of the research findings. This is a very, very high-level summary that we've put together. We've done a lot of analyses using multiple markets, around 7 to 8 markets, which includes both launch brands as well as mature brands, brands which are kind of a middle-tier brands from a share perspective with market leaders, or even brands that are laggards. And what we've seen as a consistent finding is that almost 50% of the prescribers are affiliated to an IDN. So we're talking about half of the business or half of the prescribers are affiliated. They're not solo. And that's kind of the floor. We have markets where 80% are affiliated. The second thing we found is that there's a relative impact of 20 to 25%. When I say relative, what I mean is that the affiliated doctors would have a lower share, mostly, than the non-affiliated doctors. And that delta is around 20 to 25%. We've also seen that volume is also lower. So not only from a share perspective, we've seen that product volume is around 10% lower. And what we've seen consistently is that this varies by region, geographies, but does not vary by physician specialty or market value. And our key takeaway from the study that we've done is that IDNs impact brand adoptions, sales force performance, and eventually volume growth. And hence, they're extremely critical to be understood and approached and addressed. They're also very complex, and they have pretty good, the high influence. Not all of them, but definitely the top ones that in each therapeutic area. And the third piece is that they are not the same. The top IDNs are not the same for every therapeutic class or locally. They vary. They vary by geography. They vary by therapeutic area. We've done the study across different markets, across the life cycle of the brand, to ensure that there are less biases, and we minimize any chance of a bias from either a market or a certain type of a product life cycle. Next slide, please. This is an interesting piece of information that I wanted to share with the team here. Most of the perception mostly is that the doctors that are affiliated to IDNs have a lower value, either from a share perspective or a brand potential perspective. But what we found is that for certain brands, it actually works to the benefit of the brand. And we've done some research, some primary research to understand. Here you see Januvia and Lantus. Both of them are big brands, and both of them play in a broader diabetes space. And yet, the impact of IDNs are almost directionally opposite when we look across the top MSAs. And what we've actually managed to gather when we interviewed a few folks is that Lantus had a huge brand equity. Physicians almost felt that there is no replacement for Lantus. They valued the Lantus from a patient outcome perspective, from a benefit to a patient perspective, way more than its closest competitor. And that is the reason why these corporate bodies are actually favoring Lantus over its closest competitor. So this was something interesting, which is a lot of our studies would say that IDNs have a negative impact, but in this case, it's not so. And it is aligned to the objectives of most of the IDNs. Next slide, please. We are currently doing a lot of work with multiple of our clients in different phases, be it investigation, prioritization, or implementation. And our approach is three phases. And it is aligned to the questions that clients are asking us. The first phase is, again, tied to prioritization and understanding. So we try to understand what portion of our client's business is influenced or under the control of IDNs, which are the bigger IDNs, more influential IDNs, more complex IDNs. We align them across the map, and we try to see, are they distributed across or they are grouping in certain geographies. So do we need to do something locally to address them, or do we need to have a key account management across the nation? So we're talking about, having multiple roles and responsibilities instead of focused. And finally, deployment. So we need to understand what is the right size of the team, what is the right structure of the team, what are the different roles and responsibilities, the KPIs and the tweaks to the incentive compensation, what are other clients doing that is considered benchmark, and where our client is, what the gap is, and how the gap can be bridged. Next slide, please. When you look at it from a Salesforce perspective, most of our clients are trying to understand IDNs purely based on volume. We have actually helped a lot of our clients to identify the right IDNs, volume as well as influence. And finally, we are working with some of our clients to understand volume, influence, complexity, as well as reception to Salesforce. So whether the IDN is open to even having a sales rep call its doctors, or maybe having a rep doesn't make sense from an ROI perspective, and we need to have a key account manager and some patient-driven tactics to move the share in that particular region. Next slide, please. To be able to identify and prioritize some of the bigger and the more influential IDNs, IMS has created some metrics using multiple data resources that we have. Potential is one of the primary metrics, and majority of our clients use that. So volume, share, number of affiliated patients, number of affiliated physicians. Span of control is another metric. Number of specialty, number of more important physicians, new patient mix, and their potential. The third metric is influence. And to understand influence, we use our data assets to help us understand what kind of resources the IDN has from an EMR perspective, from an ERX perspective, and more importantly, from an access perspective. We also are able to see if the account affiliated is a teaching account, a long-term care, non-teaching, health plan, or a specialty. And finally, managed care formulary is a critical piece to tie to understanding IDNs. If we don't tie that, it is very easy to get misled. So it is important to look at IDNs and have the managed care lens in place. So we want to be able to say that, is it an open access, closed access, restricted access? What kind of an environment is it, to be able to understand control? Next slide, please. In addition to that, we will overlay more information to inform us better about these IDNs. Restrictions and policies. Share variation. Are they tightly controlling the physician, or they are loosely controlling the physician? And that can be computed based on the number of physicians affiliated and their share of multiple brands. Are the share variants very close and narrow, or are they widespread? And the third thing is patient profile. We want to understand the kind of patient profiles that are under a certain IDN. Are the profile of patients so complex from a comorbidity perspective that the decision-making is very restricted? You really cannot do not have too many options for a decision. So that is extremely important for us to understand. Finally, we also would like to put it across from a map perspective and look at the footprint. So is it just huddling towards the northeast, the more influential IDNs, or it's distributed across the nation and it's scattered, so we need to focus on a more national level plan? Next slide, please. This particular view is from a client case study where we worked with a client a year back and we did this work. So we would like to also understand control in addition to what we've done so far. So is the IDN operating under a complex stakeholder environment? Is it an LTC facility, academic affiliation, health plan, or a specialty? And what portion of it is the distribution? Secondly, how many levels of corporate control are they under? Is there a sales rep access issue? So reps are not allowed. Is it a generic first? So you've got to write a generic before you write a brand. What about the formulary access? Is it closed, open, or restricted? And these are the metrics in addition that help us, in conjunction with all the other work that we have done, better understand these IDNs. Next slide, please. This slide talks a little about the patient-level information, a very, very critical piece to understand IDNs. Off and on, we don't realize that we only look at prescribers and volume and determine, but a very important piece is the patient. If the patient is very complex, if the disease state is very complex, then there isn't too many choices a prescriber can make. We would look at the patient profile under each of these IDNs, and we would understand the switches, the stop to therapy, the continuing therapy, the return to therapy, and this information will help us understand the control, the influence of the IDN better. It will complement that information of control and influence. It will help us understand the type of patients that IDN are operating with, and also why the physicians affiliated are making certain decisions. Next slide, please. IDN analyses cannot be done as a standalone. It has to be done in conjunction with payer influence. The two to play an extremely critical role, and there is interaction between the two. So it is critical for us to understand, is it the payer that is the driver, or truly it's the IDN that is the driver? And we need to drill down to identify the prescribers that are influenced by either one of them or both of them. And in order to do so, we need to bring in multiple other information like plan, copay, tier information to understand payer control, payer influence, and tease out IDN influence from payer influence. Next slide, please. IMS has been doing surveys with the top 100 or 120 IDNs every quarter to be able to understand their value proposition, their goals, and their objectives. And based on these survey results, we are tying it to the rest of the IDNs through a predictive model. And we've been able to group IDNs based on what their value proposition could look like. So an example is patient focus. We are able to identify IDNs that have a heavy patient focus. And for these IDNs, there are certain tactics that are already designed that will move these IDNs, such as patient assistance program, adherence program, educational material, disease assistance program, and diagnosis tools. There is another category of IDNs that are price sensitive. So for those IDNs, we need to address their needs accordingly, create supporting material accordingly. There are IDNs who are more inclined towards extended services like enhanced sample management program. They would like to understand best practices and what research was talking about. They want to understand patient interaction and patient journey as well as preventive programs. So to actually be able to talk and help them help us, we need to talk the language they want to hear. And this analysis and this information will help us segment the IDNs based on their value proposition and what they need, and help us design our commercial and promotional material in line with their needs. Next slide, please. Once we have identified the IDNs, created a segment based on volume, span of control, influence, and also based on the different categorization of what their needs are, what's going to move them, we will actually tie that to impact. So how much can they impact from a sales perspective? So we will build response models that for doctors affiliated versus doctors non-affiliated, and we will use those response models to eventually determine what is the impactable sales from Salesforce versus non-Salesforce, and tie that to our commercial model. Next slide, please. As I initially said when we just started the conversation, Salesforce, a reach and frequency model, is not the only thing that we need to think about. There are multiple other commercial tactics and strategies that have become more effective with the introduction and growing influence of these stakeholders. And doing this analysis will help us understand where Salesforce matters, where you should align Salesforce reaching out to physicians as well as with optimal frequency to actually impact the physician's decision, versus where you should spend money in non-Salesforce activities like webcast, conferences, DTCs, e-detailings, so that you can move the other key stakeholders. You can talk directly to the patients through these channels, and they can eventually influence the physician. We also need to understand the IDNs that do not let Salesforce talk to their doctors. They are extremely restrictive policies, and they are very complex. For them, we need to design a key account management based on their goals and their value proposition. We need to design messages and material that the key account manager will go and talk to that will resonate with these IDNs. Next slide, please. Once that is all done, this is kind of the third and the most advanced phase. It is the structure of the commercial model, the right team and the right deployment. We work very, very closely with our client stakeholders. Different teams have workshop discussions. We interview them. We also interview IDNs, and we design a Salesforce, a key account management structure that ties back to their commercial model, that is not just sales rep, DMs, or RMs, but also has multiple other roles in the mix, like reimbursement specialist, clinical liaisons, managed care support, brand support. So these roles are as critical as a rep because they provide support for the rep or the key account manager to be successful. We are able to understand, based on the role and responsibility, what kind of skill sets do these roles need to be successful, and what kind of experience they need to have to be able to be successful in these positions and roles. We help our client find those right guys for the right roles to fill in for their key account management and eventually their new commercial model structure. In addition to that, we write summaries of what it takes, what is best in class IDN planning, what are the tactics that should be aligned, and these are regional, they are not national because it varies regionally. And we tie them to account planning and their brand planning and their internal planning cycles. Next slide, please. Once you have determined what the optimal headcount, the optimal structure, what are the tools the sales force and the key account manager need, what kind of support system they need, both headquarters as well as in the field, it is critical to have some key performance indicators designed because we need to measure. This is a new concept. It's not traditionally run, tried and tested. So we need to measure the performance of these new roles, the new responsibilities, how good they are doing. And these key performance indicators are not the traditional one because this is not a traditional sales force. So we need to sit with the brand team, the management team to understand what matters and how do we measure. Since we've done this work with a lot of clients, we do have a library of key performance indicators, and we will share that with our clients, but then eventually have a discussion with the client to understand which are the ones that matter. And we will create those metrics, we will have a reporting in place, and we will measure month over month and see if there is a change in either behavior or access or performance. Next slide, please. With this, we are almost at the end of today's discussion. As I earlier started off the discussion, it is extremely important to uncover the various influences because there are multiple players, multiple influencers in the decision making. Doctors are not the single point of contact anymore, and we need to understand which are the players, what are the influences, how big are the influences to be able to be successful in the pharma landscape. In addition to that, there are a lot of other challenges that we face. There are big brands are going generic. Generic market is growing. Payer influence is growing. Health system is growing. There is healthcare reforms in place and multi-marketing influences in place. And it is very, very critical to have a commercial model that understands the drivers, the influences, that understand the marketing objectives and works in conjunction with the contracting team to be successful.
Okay, so are we ready to go to Q&A, Anindita?
Yes.
Outstanding. Well, before we get right into that Q&A, I just want to encourage those in the audience that they can still contact IMS for a deeper discussion on these issues, much deeper than we can go into in just a one-hour web event. So if you have any questions resulting from today's webcast, or if you just want to request a copy of the slides, contact us at bconnor@us.imshealth.com and put webinar in the subject line. Throughout this presentation segment of the webinar, we've all heard and seen a lot of great information. Healthcare communications methods change rapidly, and this information will certainly help us all stay on top of the latest practices. Now, we've only scratched the surface on this complex topic, so please make sure you send in your questions if you want to go into greater depth on the issues discussed today. Well, now it's time for our Q&A session, and this is always a very popular segment in our web seminars. We already have a whole bunch of outstanding questions sent in from the attendees, so thanks to all of you that have sent those in. For those of you that haven't but you still have questions, you can type your question into the Ask a Question text area in the bottom corner of your screen and click the Submit button. Due to the time constraints, we may not be able to respond to all the questions submitted today, and I'd like to reiterate that all registered participants will receive an email in about a week with access to an archive of this web event. Well, now I'd like to turn it over to Jody Fisher. Jody's the Director of U.S. Marketing at IMS, and he's going to run the Q&A. Jody?
Thanks, Dan. And indeed, a great presentation. There have been many excellent questions that have been submitted by some of the viewers. So ready to tackle a few of them?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. First question that was submitted, could you talk a little bit about what IDNs want from pharmas right now when many of these IDNs, in fact, restrict access to pharmacos?
Sorry, Jody, I couldn't hear the first part of the question.
That's all right. So could you talk about what IDNs want from pharmas right now when many IDNs restrict access to pharmacos at this point?
Yep, thank you. Sure. So as I said, IDNs are not driven purely for profit, right? They have the patient outcome, the patient benefit in their mind. They have clinical focus in their mind. They also have financial focus, and financial focus basically means improving efficiencies, reducing cost. Patient experience is very, very important to them, and that's the reason IDNs don't want sales rep to come and influence decision-making of a physician. They want physician to make a decision based on these changed goals and not so much on profitability. And that's one of the reasons we found, having talked to different IDNs as well as some of the physicians that are affiliated, that they restrict sales reps so that they cannot influence to write certain brands, and when there are cheaper alternatives in the market.
So then there's actually another question that was asked, Anindita, that could, I think, easily follow up to that answer. So with increasing constraints on manufacturers to interface with prescribers, what are some recommended alternative approaches that manufacturers could take that would create interest with prescribers or the IDNs?
Right. Wonderful. That's a very good question. So when we've done work with many of our clients, what we have seen is one very recent example, working with one of the top 10 pharma companies, that DTC is more effective in areas and regions which are tightly controlled by IDNs. So we've done a test control analysis to make sure we are looking at like doctors and like exposures, and we've seen that the effectiveness of DTC is higher. This is nothing surprising, because what it tells us is that you cannot reach the doctor. You cannot really move the doctor, but you can reach the doctor via other channels. For example, patients. DTC is more patient-focused. So automatically, if you are able to convince the patient that this is the right drug for you, the patient will have a conversation with the doctor. Other channels that a lot of our clients have started using are non-personal promotions, and they're trying to reach the physician through a webcast, conferences, electronic detailing, internet. So even if you're unable to see the doctor in person, by some means you're able to send a message to the doctor. Now, having said that, these channels are definitely not as effective in terms of driving contribution as a sales rep. Like sales rep has direct conversation with the doctor and hence has a higher recall. But when we are talking about an environment where rep have no access at all, these channels do pretty well.
Thanks for answering that. So moving on, there's another question that was submitted where the question was, is the influence from specialty pharmaceuticals such as oncology and immunology types of drugs equally important across IDNs? I believe your example was from the diabetes market principally. So can you talk about, Anindita, principally how specialty types of drugs may or may not be similar?
Oh, that's a very, very good question. So surprisingly, what we have seen that the influence in oncology, biologics, or more specialty kind of brands is higher than that of the non-specialty. I can say, because we've done some work in oncology, 80% plus of the oncologists are affiliated to an IDN or a group practice or corporate parent. And we've seen that the IDN restriction and policies are much more rigid or, stronger in a specialty space than in a more like a retail, diabetes space. So in my experience, I would say specialty is more controlled by these stakeholders than non-specialty. Specialty is also growing. That is where, the growth is, where most of the research is being done. Hence, based on that, these stakeholders are only going to grow in terms of their influence.
Okay. So we did get a question about the metrics that you mentioned that would be important to measure. So the question was, what were the metrics that you mentioned and identified as important in tracking and identifying IDNs and even ACOs of interest?
Okay. So we have multiple, performance indicators to track. Of course, the primary ones would be, sales and share and penetration. But where you don't have access to Salesforce, these may not matter as much. So at that, for those strongly restricted areas and geographies, we look at, so we do primary research with IDNs, pre and post implementation, and we try to see if the impression or the thinking of the IDN has changed based on having interacted with a key account manager. Is he getting value by having a discussion with the key account manager? Is the key account manager being able to meet his needs, his requirements, and address his concerns? So those are the things we try to measure through primary research. Now, keep in mind, when we do this work, when we target IDNs, although there are 905 of them, we don't go target all of them. When we start this work with most of our larger to mid-sized companies, we have looked at the top 50, top 65 to top 80 of them. And we've actually done pilots to understand. And when you're doing pilots, we're talking about 20 or 15 of them. So that's how you start small, but eventually implement in a large scale. So we talk to C-suites and key decision makers. We segment our custom based on value index, so what kind of things they want, and eventually try to understand, are they getting that information? And this is all primary data.
Okay. So a question that's actually been submitted by multiple people is, we're going to ask you to polish your crystal ball a little bit. How will the Affordable Care Act affect some of the strategies that you've talked about in this presentation? And so there have been a variety of questions that have come in about the potential to opt out of Obamacare, through Obamacare, so on and so forth. But how will the ACA affect some of these strategies?
Well, that's also a very, very good question. So with these different acts in place, what we feel, and it's not a very, very black and white today. There are different school of thoughts. People think differently. And there is no definitive answer. I've talked to multiple clients. I've talked to folks who in conferences. Nobody really knows what the right answer is. But there are multiple right answers that's out there. And having spoken to different people, it seems that in 4 to 5 years from now, these IDNs will become way more complex. So they will also be payers. And when that happens, it's almost like being an ACO. When that happens, it would be almost, I wouldn't say difficult, but it's complex to understand what is the right strategy. Is it purely a commercial play, where we talk about, designing different commercial tactics and strategies and sales force and non-sales force, key account managers, or is it going to be a contracting play where you're talking about copay and tiers and copay differentials, or is it going to be a mix and match of both? So do we have almost a new role created within the sales force where people talk about copay, so talk about contracting strategy, how they are better off than competition, how they bring about more value to the patient. So there are these different thoughts. So it's hard to say how it's going to look like because there is no really one right answer.
So, Anindita, you've been these have been great answers to the questions. I think we have time for one more question, and so there have been fantastic questions submitted. A theme of many of the questions that have been submitted ask the following question: which stakeholders in the corporate IDNs are most important to reach to impact product protocols, and what role could medical affairs liaisons or similar type of roles play in that influence? So which stakeholders are the most important at this point, do you see?
Yeah. So I've heard this from a lot of other folks too. So that medical sales liaison, is that even a part of the structure? And when we were having a couple of workshops with a client, we figured that they are. They're not directly a part, so obviously they're not going out and approaching or selling directly, but they are actually providing a lot of information that can help the account managers speak more efficiently and more effectively with the IDNs. And when we talk about stakeholders within the IDNs, we are talking about the senior management. We're not talking about mid-level staff, right? We're either talking about directors or C-suite people that you need to have conversations with, and you only have one chance to talk to these people. And it's extremely important to understand where their focus is and be able to create material to have a very meaningful and valuable conversation with them. And medical sales liaisons come in to create those materials, help provide that value.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Anindita. Dan, I'm going to turn it back to you to conclude.
Thanks, Jody. Great job with the Q&A. Anindita, thanks for handling all of those questions from the audience. I hope you all enjoyed this event and have taken away some new insights. If any of your colleagues missed this presentation, once again, it will be available as an archive in about a week, and you'll be notified with the link via email. I'd like to once again thank our friends at IMS for sponsoring this event. Anindita did an outstanding job presenting and handling our questions. At Pharma Voice, we're always looking for better ways to bring you quality events that address your key issues. We also encourage you to look for future web seminars by visiting pharmavoice.com. Go to the Resources tab and select Web Links Web Seminars. We want to thank you for investing your time in our web event. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day. The event is now over.